Loading. Welcome to Access the Animus.
Hello everyone and welcome to a new video here on Access the Animus. In this new video from our series dedicated to the analysis of Assassin's Creed Valhalla and its context, we're going to once again pierce through the mythological veil and witness Odin's final confrontation with Loki, his sacrifice aimed at saving himself and the other Asgardian Isu, and a final explanation about how the seventh method of salvation would work. Speaking of the seventh method, we're also going to delve into Odin's theft of its component within the Grand Temple, where he also found references to the six methods of salvation and even to the creation myth, and we're going to show how this theft was instrumental to Juno's creation of the Aita Sages from Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, not without a few inconsistencies with the established lore. Quite a number of topics as usual, so let's dive right in. These are the actual events that led to Odin's sacrifice and the activation of the seventh method of salvation. Once again, we pick up where we left off, with Odin darting inside the Grand Temple and being immediately spotted by Minerva. In the game, having obtained the gift for her earlier in the arc, which seemed to be the canon path as it had a dedicated chapter of the arc itself, allows Odin to romance her. So assuming that was the case, as the other options lead to a violent outcome, Odin was able to deceive her too and to, let's say, distract her and make her fall asleep to eventually move in the vault unspotted and undetected. This led him to find 6 documents which, within the Jotunheim arc, depict the creation myth according to the Norse mythology and more specifically the Prose Edda. While the 6 documents are basically a retelling of the actual Norse creation myth, about which we'll leave a link in the description, the few elements that may be of interest to us for now are that the Isu Odin might have killed his father, helped by his brother Vili and Ve, and, more importantly, that if the allegory holds here, that it was actually the Aesir, that is the Asgardian Isu, that created the first humans. Named Ask and Embla in the Norse mythology, these were meant, according to the document, to worship the Asgardian Isu and serve them, while also staying away from the Jotnar, the Greco-Roman ones. On another level of interpretation, Ask and Embla might also be the equivalent of Adam and Eve, who, in the Isu narrative, weren't the first humans created by the Isu, but were likely 2 of the first human-Isu hybrids conceived in order to preserve the Isu DNA. If that interpretation of the Norse myth within the Assassin's Creed narrative was correct, then it would mean that the Asgardian Isu created the human Isu hybrids so that they could start a war of their own against their sworn enemy, the Greco-Roman Isu. Whatever the interpretation, Odin pressed on and went deeper in the Grand Temple, where he found, as we called it in our previous video, a testament to all the 6 methods of salvation that had previously failed. We'll hopefully have a video dedicated to the 6 methods at some point to better understand what's happening here, but suffice to say that the room in the Jotunheim arc presents them as such. The first one involved 4 towers that would capture and disperse the solar flare, as we mentioned in our previous videos. The second one involved rings, or better yet, technology, supposedly created by the Isu Idun to create a shield that would protect the world, here named as the Norse 9 Realms. The third one, which attempted to use the Apples of Eden, supposedly fashioned or created by Idun, to amplify the mind and will of all creatures and avoid the catastrophe. The fourth one, which allowed to send messages across time, that was Minerva's one. The fifth one, which implied an armor of sorts to protect the bodies of the Isu from the consequences of the catastrophe, and the sixth one, which involved vessels where the Isu could transfer their conscience. Now, hardcore fans might have spotted some inaccuracies or inconsistencies with the established lore here and there, but as we mentioned, we might have a dedicated video to explain more in detail what those methods were. At the end of the day, what matters here is that finally Odin reached the final room of the vault and obtained the technology used to create the 7th method. Once again, Odin dashed out of the Grand Temple ready to reach Juno, but was immediately caught red-handed as Loki, who knew about Odin's intent since he had captured him in his own house, had tipped off Jupiter about his plan, even appearing as a good Jotun who shared the information to protect his people. Obviously, a fight between Odin and Jupiter ensued, and bear in mind, if there's a villain here, in this specific situation at least, in our opinion, it is Odin, who selfishly stole the method to save himself and his own Acer friends while endangering an immeasurable number of human lives as Jupiter suggested. Equally obviously, Odin won the fight without killing Jupiter, who with his last words told him that by actually using the seventh method, he would change the destiny of countless other people, but not his own. Loki was nowhere to be found because the trickster was waiting for Odin for a final confrontation right in front of the so-called Well of Mimir, where Odin was traveling to in order to reach Juno. Odin started by calling Loki Oathbreaker because he imprisoned him in his house, to which Loki answered that Odin had done the same to his son. Odin then countered by calling Loki out about tipping Jupiter off, but Loki again answered that he did it because what Odin did was only for himself and his people, but not the other Isu, let alone Loki himself. Odin then launched a third verbal attack, criticizing Loki for causing the death of so many Isu in the attack to Asgard, only to selfishly save his son. In this case, and as we saw in our analysis of Odin's and Loki's stories, Loki admits he had to organize all the machinations surrounding his son Fenrir's arrival to Asgard, and those were caused by the fact that the Greco-Roman Isu had also found about Fenrir's true nature and wanted to kill him. Finally, Loki couldn't wait anymore. He couldn't trust that Odin would have actually kept his son alive despite the calculations, and so ordered Odin to release his son from his imprisonment, otherwise he'd have to kill him. Thus, another fight followed, and once again Odin emerged victorious, but Loki escaped, with the promise that their game wasn't over, and that he would have renewed their fight in the future. Finally, Odin reached the Well of Mimir, and interestingly enough, the area looks very similar to the entrance of the Yggdrasil vault in Norway. Maybe it's just our feeling, as this vault should be located in the area governed by the Greco-Roman Isu, represented here by Jotunheim, but judging by the ice, the lake in front of it, the corridors, the Yggdrasil roots in the last rooms, well, you know. Anyway, eventually Odin found Juno, and curiously enough, he found her holding not an apple, but a crystal ball, stating the sentence, "The probabilities led us here, the calculations give us hope." This is not a random sentence, as this is sort of a double reference. These are the exact words that Eivor hears from the crystal ball in the Vinland Ark, right in front of the entrance to the Grand Temple from AC3, showing that Juno was sending a message of her own across time when Odin found her, but also this is a confirmation that that is the same crystal ball that then ended up in the hands of the Kanyenka people seen in Assassin's Creed 3, through which she also sent messages to Connor and eventually made it so that at the right time she could be released to the world by Desmond's sacrifice. Odin showed he had finally stolen the technology for the seventh method, but Juno told him not to use it right away because the Hugr, that is, the mind, would quote-unquote take flight and be ever fixed. In the allegory, Juno was saying that by using the seventh method, a copy of his conscience would have been transferred to the human DNA, so he needed to do it as close to the day of the Toba catastrophe as possible in order to transfer a more recent version of his mind. Right after that, a new voice, that of Mimir, interjected, with a dialogue that basically seems to confirm that this is actually the Yggdrasil vault in Norway, or at least it's connected to it. As a matter of fact, Mimir mentioned that that was a place where the Hugr, that is, the mind, and conscience, is stored, and even went on to say that those are stored by the so-called World Tree. In our opinion, even he, Mimir himself, was talking from within the device, as both he and Odin say that he was killed but his conscience was still there, which forced him to live incomplete, as in without a body, but at least he survived. Seeing that Mimir was talking from within the supposed Yggdrasil device also checks out with the fact that his voice is very metallic and very mechanical as well.
Your body will die, but your Hugr will live on here.
Mimir stated that that specific vault would endure the Toba catastrophe and would remember, as in it would be able to keep the minds and conscience of those who would use it. More specifically, it is explained that the Isu that might look for immortality, as in somehow surviving the catastrophe, along with the technology used for the seventh method, they would also need another item that is shown here as the waters of the well for the method to work. Remembering Loki's words from the Animus Anomalies dialogues, the seventh method would work through the use of a serum and a catalyst, so it's entirely possible that the mead in the Jotunheim Ark is the serum, hence why it's represented in a liquid form, while the waters of Mimir's well that have to work along with the serum and are needed to store the Isu mines are the catalysts required for the method itself to work. But of course, everything comes at a price. In order to obtain the supposed catalyst, in order for it to remember, that is, in order to be able to save a copy of a conscience when the seventh method is activated, the catalyst itself must recognize the conscience and its holder, and in order to do that, it has to be quote-unquote infused with the blood of the Aesir. This last part is more tricky to interpret, as it leads to Odin's sacrifice, but it may mean that, in order to be able to copy and upload the conscience of the various Asgardian Isu, here called the Aesir, and of Odin in particular, the catalyst needs to know of a way to recognize them, which in all likeliness depends on their DNA. It's not clear why Odin couldn't just sacrifice a few drops of his blood instead of his eye in order to make sure the catalyst could work for him and the other Asgardian Isu, but we surely know he indeed lost his eye as seen in the Hidden Truth video. From within the Yggdrasil device, Mimir's conscience seemed to warn Odin that if he and the other Asgardian Isu were to actually proceed with the seventh method, they would tarnish the destiny of the humans who would survive the catastrophe. Odin even said that he knew because he had already been told by Minerva, but nonetheless he decided to proceed. Mimir then confirmed to Odin how things would work if he were to actually sacrifice his eye and set in motion the activation of the seventh method. He told him that while the catastrophe would rage all around, which would also lead to the demise of Odin himself, the World Tree, as in the Yggdrasil device, would keep a copy of Odin's conscience inside of it, allowing him to be reborn in time in a new world rebuilt after the Toba catastrophe. Interestingly enough, Juno confirmed what Mimir said, saying that she hoped to do the same to quote-unquote one I love dearly who depends upon it. That is a reference to Aita, her husband, who, as we mentioned in our previous videos, was used as a test subject for the fifth method, which failed and caused him to eventually become a beating heart without a mind. This means that this encounter with Odin takes place right before Juno will start using the seventh method to make it so that the DNA and conscience of his husband would be mixed with the human genome, leading to the so-called sages, or more specifically, the Aita Sages as seen in Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. So, it was finally time. Odin decided to make the sacrifice and to proceed with the seventh method, making it so that the catalyst would recognize his DNA. In the background, players can hear the voice of Alethea in a dialogue from the early stages of the Jotunheim Ark, where she asked about how much Odin would sacrifice in order to avoid his destiny. These words that are possibly ringing in Odin's mind show how desperate and to a degree even selfish Odin was to save himself despite the calculation foretelling his death. Odin is then seen using his right hand to collect or touch the waters of the well, remember that's the catalyst of the method, and with the same hand he finally plucks his own eye, in a scene where the eye is compared multiple times to the aerial view of the Chamber of the Vault where Odin and Juno are currently located. Thus, Odin paid the price, and it's not clear if it just sacrificed his eye or more, but the waters, that is the catalyst, recognized Odin's DNA and also activated the vault, or more likely the Yggdrasil device. That was also confirmed by one of the most classic sentences spoken by Juno and the Isu in general. It is done. Eventually, Odin collected the catalyst, which he put together with the serum, and in that occasion, Mimir from inside the device confirmed that after activating the catalyst, everyone who would drink the mead, that is, whoever decided to use the seventh method, would have their conscience copied within the Yggdrasil device, here mentioned as the Word Tree will remember them. Lastly, Juno mentioned that her collaboration with Odin and especially her use of the seventh method wouldn't have been forgiven by Jupiter and Minerva, and we know the reason for that is that they, especially Minerva, did not want the method to be used in order to preserve the destiny of humanity. Because of that, Juno expected she'd be hunted by both of them. Juno here confirmed once again that she was part of the triad of political leaders known as the Father of Understanding, the Mother of Wisdom, and the Sacred Voice, and that they were behind the 6 attempts or methods designed to avert the Toba catastrophe, which sadly failed. Juno also confirmed that she had designed the 7th method, even though she said we, and that when Jupiter and Minerva found out about it, out of their fear for the potential consequences on the human race after the catastrophe, they locked it in the vault and banished Juno from their city, even though she supposedly kept her title of Mother of Wisdom, as the dialogues in the Animus Anomalies state that she was stripped of her title after giving the 7th method to Odin. Thus, Juno stated that by stealing the serum and in general the technology for the 7th method, he just returned to her what she believed to be rightfully hers. Finally, Juno confirmed that with a few changes to the mead, that is to the catalyst, she might still find a way to bring her husband, that is Aita, back to life, which is exactly what she did with the sages we saw in Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. This dialogue also serves as context both for the first civilization events that we knew from the early games of the franchise and also for the events shown in Valhalla. As for what concerns Valhalla, this should have happened right before the anomaly message featuring Aletheia getting to know about Juno being stripped of her title, while it should also have happened after the 6 methods of salvation as shown in AC3 failed, but before the creation of the Aita Sages, so with Aita still being alive, although just as a beating heart without a mind. At the same time though, this final dialogue of the Jotunheim arc also brings some additional inconsistencies with the established lore from past games. As a matter of fact, according to Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, Juno actually created the Sages by participating in some experiments created by Minerva and aimed at giving humans the chance of passing the accumulations of their learnings from one generation to the next through their DNA. During said experiments, Juno would secretly add Aita's DNA to that of the humans, creating the Aita Sages, but as we know from Valhalla, by this time Juno had both been exiled and stripped of her title, so she likely wasn't the first person Minerva would call to help with such experiments. This dialogue also states that the creation of the 7th method, and especially Juno's help in allowing Odin, an enemy, to steal it, would be the cause for Jupiter and Minerva to hunt her down, but in Assassin's Creed 3, and more specifically in its guide, it was stated that they hunted her down because of her plans to take over the world by fomenting a rebellion during the Isu era in order to prevent the humans from getting hold of it, all the while Jupiter and Minerva were actually trying to save it from the catastrophe. So yeah, completely different reasons which could even coexist, although it might be a stretch and would definitely make Juno a very bad Isu, but they eventually lead to the same outcome. In fact, as mentioned in AC3 and its guide, when Jupiter and Minerva found out about Juno's plans, they stopped her, as in killed her and her followers, sealing the Grand Temple with the bodies of the traitors inside, but somehow, with her last effort, she was able to transfer her conscience in the Grand Temple machinery to start her millenary plan involving Desmond. Despite these potential inconsistencies, that was the last of Odin's trip to the territory of the Greco-Roman Isu, as much as this is the ending of our video. Join us in our next video, where we'll have a look at what Odin really did when he got back to Asgard, his final fight with Fenrir, and the last calculation he saw about the fate of Asgard and his own. If you enjoyed this video though, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and turning the notifications on so you won't miss any of our future updates. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.